Hello, you're listening to the finale episode of Season 5 of The Rare Life, and I am so honored to be joined with Brittany Steitz, who is the newest member of the Rare Life team, to celebrate another awesome season. Can you say hi, Brittany?
Hi, Madeline. Hi, everyone. I'm just very humbled and honored to be here today.
I'm so glad you're joining me. I've always felt like a little awkward and lame being on these finale episodes by myself, so it's fun to have someone to celebrate with on here instead of just me talking. So thanks for joining. I normally would leave this part till later in the episode, but as a little explanation of like who you are and why you're here, can you just explain a little bit about your journey onto the team and how that's worked out and what exactly it is that you're doing?
So Madeline and I connected through social media. I had a skeletal dysplasia diagnosis, CDPX1 at 20 weeks, and there weren't a lot of resources available, but the Rare Life podcast came up in one of my late night Google searches. Madeline and I immediately connected through Instagram, and fast forward several months, we unfortunately lost our son in utero, and through my healing and through therapy, I was trying to figure out ways to give back to the community that had given me so much in a short amount of time. And I really felt like the way I described it to my therapist is I was standing on a stage and the curtains opened and I was exposed to this world of being a medical mother, having a medically complex child, working through a rare genetic diagnosis. And then when we lost Logan unexpectedly, the curtains closed and the lights went off. And all of a sudden I was looking around like, now what? What am I supposed to do? Because I'm a doer. I'm the oldest in my family. My dad jokingly calls me the Sarge for sergeant, and I do things and I make things happen. And I just felt like I really wanted to give back and support the community that I still feel very much a part of today. So I messaged Madeline and I was like, here's my idea. First, I would like to sponsor an episode. And then we got to talking about other ways that I could apply some of the skills I have to help bring the podcast some support. And fast forward several months and here we are.
Yes. Oh, I love it so much. And I guess I forgot to mention that her story would probably sound familiar because she did sponsor episode 89. And so I shared a bit about her in that episode, and I'm excited that she's joining me today to celebrate season 5. So we will talk a bit more about Brittany's role in the behind the scenes section of this episode, but you joining me in this mission and giving much needed support has been very life-giving to the podcast as a whole and has helped me reignite a fire that kind of was petering out a little bit because of burnout and stuff and trying to do this all on my own. And so Brittany has been such a lifeblood to the podcast, and I love that she has this mission behind it and the reasoning behind it, and that she's like just as passionate about it as I am. And I'm excited to, later on in the episode, we'll talk more about specifics of ways that she's been supporting and ways that you can too. And I'm excited to update you guys. But for now, yeah, that's who Brittany is. That's why she's joining us. Okay, so per tradition for finale episodes, we are going to listen to 3 different listeners who sent in audio clips, messages of the impact of the Rare Life as a whole, and then their favorite episodes from season 5. And I love hearing those. And then we will talk about updates and behind the scenes, and that's where Brittany comes in a lot more. But first, we are going to hear season 5 kind of summed up in 3 minutes. It's a bunch of tiny audio clips from each episode chronologically, so we can kind of jog our memories on the different episodes that were included in season 5. Here we go.
But I was like so excited. I'm like, I'm officially and legally her mom. Like, my name is going on her birth certificate now. Her passing is definitely like the hardest thing that's ever happened to either of us, but we were both like, yeah, we would do this like 100 times over because Zarette deserved it.
I think so many times we feel silenced to these really negative emotions and like articulating them and sharing them lest others misunderstand and think that those negative emotions are directed at our children themselves.
Just try. It all just takes just a tiny little thread you just need to pull and experiment with it.
I couldn't get through to him. And so at the time, I just remember feeling like this glass wall between us, and me reaching out to him and him reaching out to me. I just remembered the intensity of, I've got to fix this. I've got to fix him.
You're allowed to say that this isn't fair, that A, first and foremost, my kid has to go through it, but B, that I have to go through this.
Life as her mother isn't about fixing her because she is already perfect.
I am a much more confident advocate.
Have become a better person.
I now have the ability to push through so that I can be the best version of myself.
I'm just so blessed to have learned all I have from her.
We had a couple moments where we just looked at each other and we laughed and we were like, did you ever think that we would be sitting here like splinting our infant child's leg? You start to wonder, what is God's role in this?
When I finally got to that point where I understood that the grieving cycle was always going to be part of the journey, I've learned to give myself more grace.
There are parents whose full identity is wrapped up in being the parent of a child with a disability, but they don't recognize that that's a separate identity than having a disability.
It's hard. We spend so much time either in the car or at an actual appointment that there's some days they don't even get to play with their toys because we are literally gone all day. There's a lot of just survival.
It really is a very common human experience and coping mechanism that we're numbing out because we want to make it through what's happening.
I think gratitude can be super healing, but when it's just kind of shoved in your face like this, it feels more like a shutdown rather than that healing feeling of authentic gratitude.
It's a lot. We carry a super heavy load and we need rest, but rest is hard.
I'm just like, I went back in time to like when I listened to each episode and just relived all the feelings that I felt when hearing them again.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to think about each of the episodes. I was going to mention this later, but I was reflecting because we're just coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the podcast. And I was thinking about how each of the episodes in and of themselves feel like little projects I poured hours into, and like a little, almost like a little painting of its own little masterpiece. I don't know if I can call it a masterpiece myself, but like I feel like that, like as the artist trying to pour my heart into this with the guests, and then like that they all piece together, make this bigger picture of the podcast as a whole. And so celebrating 2 years, I'm like, oh my gosh, so many episodes. We're coming up on 100 episodes and each one represents so much blood, sweat, and tears. But like, I'm also like so happy and grateful thinking about each one of those and having shared those with the guests that I interviewed and with each of the listeners and the messages I've received. And it's just been such a huge thing in my life. And it's been so amazing. And I just feel so grateful. And that applies to season 5 too. Listening to each of the snippets, it's like, oh man, I remember that one. Or like, oh, that one took forever to schedule. But it's kind of like the behind the scenes of the love that went into each one, but then also hearing about the impact from listeners has been just so humbling.
And I know that you and I have talked about this before, but you feel like in 2 years, it's gone so fast, but been so long. But me as just a new listener since October, November of last fall, I step back and I'm like, wow, look at this community that this podcast has helped formed. Look at the topics and the discussions that these amazing families are having and that you're able to share. And in such isolating moments that happen in these episodes, that everyone can collectively come together and talk about that and share their experiences with those moments. And I just am blown away. And I think that's the most powerful strength of this platform.
I love that. I've been thinking too about like the theme of season 5, where it was all about our personal evolution as people and the good and the bad, like things that change you forever. Like you were mentioning, because of losing Logan, now you're like, oh my gosh, am I lose my other child too? You know, it just kind of, it changes the way that we think and the way that we live in some ways that are really, really cool and some ways that are not as cool. But I've really enjoyed focusing on this theme for this season. I'm feeling a little sad leaving it behind because it's been really cool to like really delve into that. Even though in a lot of ways we talk about this theme too throughout the other 2 seasons, but
Well, and I think back on all the episodes, and I just really took so much away personally from each of them, whether it was identifying things that I was maybe just to my own special episode, gaslighting your own grief, or even really relating to the numbing out episode of thinking, wow, that really is a coping mechanism that I've been leaning on, not only recently since the loss of Logan, but pretty much for a long time. And to be able to recognize that and then tangibly bring it to the light and then either work through ways to improve it or just be okay with identifying as in that's what I need in this moment. So I think so many takeaways from those episodes this season have just given me a lot of bullet points and decision points, which has been helpful.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the topics have been things that relate not just to having a child with rare conditions or with disabilities, but it can also relate to life as a whole. And yeah, that has been really cool for me too, like to really dive into that and hear different people's perspectives on things and be able to relate it to things that are not just about our children, which I do think is a cool thing. Well, let's jump into the takeaways. I love this part. I love hearing from listeners, hearing your voices, because I get a lot of written messages, but to hear someone talking about it is, I don't know, I feel like a parent's pride of like, oh, my child. Like, I don't know, like it just feels so good to hear.
You should be proud. I mean, again, just want to compliment you again on this amazing community and platform because it is important and needed and people feel heard and seen. It's just really important.
Thank you, Brittany. You're my hype lady. I love hearing from you about this. It makes me feel so
Sidecar hype lady. Go, Madeline.
All right, so let's listen to Hillary first. Hillary is not a parent listener. She is a professional, and I love our professional listeners because, again, like I mentioned this before in other finales, but I just love the idea that you care enough to hear the parent perspective. So let's listen to Hillary's message.
Hi, my name is Hillary. I'm a dietitian and I work in a children's hospital in Michigan. I also own a private practice called Blended Tube Feeding, teaching parents how to improve their child's health and digestive issues with real food. This podcast has been so valuable to me personally and professionally. Madeline and her guests' authenticity and vulnerability is so needed. Through my various hospital setting jobs, I've witnessed so many parents feeling confused, frustrated, and unheard by medical professionals. I became committed to taking the time to hear parents' perspective, but I also see how our current healthcare system is not set up well for this, as it seems to be focusing more on the numbers than on patient care. That is why this podcast is so important, because it gives medical professionals like me insight into parents' perspective. It is so valuable to hear parent stories from the beginning, with all the raw emotions, good and bad. It is a consistent reminder that there is so much more going on than I realize, and it's helping me to be a better listener so I can support parents in what they truly need. My favorite episode of season 5 is the episode on health anxiety with Amanda Griffith. I'm an empathetic person, but I do not have the same lived experiences as a medical parent. This episode gave me so much insight into what parents may be going through and reminded me how important it is to go into each visit, giving the parents space to share where they are at so we can develop a plan together that best serves them and their child. I am so thankful for this podcast and will continue to spread awareness to other medical professionals so we can continue to learn from parents' perspective and better serve our medically complex children.
Again, I love hearing from professionals that are listening. I was going to save this for later, but I think this would be a great time to talk about the ambassador program. So for those of you who follow me on Instagram and on Facebook, you may have heard about this, you may have not. And for those who aren't there, I want to tell you about this. So Brittany and I together have recently created what we call the Rare Life Ambassador Team. And that is basically a way for us to get this podcast to more people who need it, both professionals and families. And a lot of times when professionals know about this, like someone like Hillary, they can also tell their families about it. And I love the professionals knowing what it's like for us. I love the families having that solidarity. We have about, 25, I think now, members of the ambassador team that have already joined. And if that speaks to you, we have not even had our first meetup. We're doing monthly meetups. We'll talk about goals and how we're doing in sharing the podcast to mainly professionals in our lives that we have connections with to help get the word out. And so if you are an avid listener, if this has impacted you, if you want to share this with people, if you want to join the team, I would love to hear from you. There'll be a link in the show notes and we can add you to our GroupMe group. And I'd love to chat with each of you every month on these Zoom calls. I think the estimated time I have that I would like you to be able to commit to is 3 to 4 hours a month. So it's not huge, but having real live listeners being able to recommend this from that authentic place of like, hey, I've listened to this. I love it. I want you to share it with people. This could be so impactful is invaluable because Brittany and I were like, we need to get this to more people. And I was like, I'm up to my eyeballs and just trying to like make these episodes. I don't know if I can take the time to contact individual people. And so this is where you come in. So again, check out the link if you want to help us with that.
And what's been so amazing is I'm blown away by the amount of people that reached out just on our initial idea of this. And then to see what part of the country they're from, what part of the world, everyone's so excited to share their network and connections. We've opened up just a lot of doors in different parts of the medical community. And I'm just really excited to see how more people can come together to spread the word.
It really is incredible. I was pretty floored out. My goal was like 8 to 12 people. But to have so many people step up and be like, yeah, I want to give back, like Brittany was talking about, because I do think that there is some amount of healing with that and purpose in that. And so I love how many people stepped up to this, and I am excited to rub shoulders with each of them personally. And so there's our plug for that. If you want to look into that, message me with the link in the show notes so we can find more people like Hillary, because I love that she has been listening and that she cares, and it's just great.
And my personal genetic counselor, shout out to my girl Sam. I would be nowhere without her. And I think all of the families have really special people and connections and team members of their tribe that they can lean on and share with. And I'm excited for them all to come together.
Yeah, because these people really do matter. Like, it's an interesting thing where, like Hillary was saying, there isn't really an emphasis on what's happening behind the scenes for parents in the medical world or the therapy world. But it's a huge part of it, right? Like, we are humans. We're not robots. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think what really resonated me was listening to Julianne's story and thinking, okay, well, if you're a genetic counselor, you may study OI, you may know it from what a textbook is, but here's a family who is sharing their story of what it was really like going in those first few days and hours of the diagnosis and giving you really inside look into what was happening in between the doctor's appointments in which you saw them and what life is like behind the scenes. And I think to give the medical service providers that perspective is invaluable. I would think you get to really understand what's happening in your patients' lives.
Yeah. And I think like the golden part of all this is that the podcast was never created for this. Like, it was not intended to be, here, look at what it's like for us. So it's all focused on, let's just share with each other and have this safe space to share. And then to have people kind of listening in, like people who care, the professionals who are the type that want to know this kind of thing, kind of listening in and knowing that we're just sharing. Like, this is not, oh, this is what I want my doctors to know. It's just like, no, like I was mad. I was pissed. That doctor didn't treat me right or whatever. Like, they can hear what we're talking about, which is, I think, is so valuable because it's so authentic.
Yes, I think the power of transparency, good and bad, and true feelings, happiness, joy, and also frustration and trauma. That is what makes us all human and what connects us all at our core. And really, again, just takes that medical care to a deeper level from my perspective, at least.
Yeah. Well, and it also brings to mind too, and then we'll move to the next takeaway, but it's just the response that the 2 episodes from season 4, so last season, of what your doctor wants you to know but doesn't tell you, and Confessions of a NICU Nurse. Like, I didn't know that they would have, I mean, honestly, I thought they'd be kind of like mediocre listens, but they like skyrocketed. They broke all records of people wanting to have that relationship and be like, yeah, let's go beyond just the medical exchange. Like, these are humans in our lives that we see all the time and we actually deeply care about, and like, we want to know that they care about us too. And so I can see that, like, we're hungry for that human connection that is often missing. Click the link if you want to join our ambassador team. Okay, so let's jump ahead to Laurel's takeaways. She is a parent listener, and I love what she has to say.
Hi, my name is Laurel, and I am mom to 3 children, Hannah, 5, Jonathan, 4, and Micah, 2. We live in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Jonathan and Micah have a rare genetic disease called Barth syndrome, a mitochondrial life-shortening disease that affects the muscles. I discovered this podcast when I was in hospital with my son Micah when he was in a critical state with his heart. Through the podcast, I quickly identified my place of belonging in the family of the rare disease community and empathized with the many caregivers and parents who, like me, had to reconcile with a new identity as an advocate. The Rare Life podcast has helped equip me for what I have had to walk through. I appreciate hearing different perspectives, especially from medical personnel, as it has given me a greater sense of purpose through educating myself on the various aspects of caring for someone with a complex medical disease. Every time I listen to the podcast, I feel like I can more knowledgeably and compassionately navigate our world. I always recommend this podcast to those who feel like a diagnosis is a lot to bear on their own, because the podcast is an anchor of hope to remind them that they are not alone. My favorite episode of the season was episode 83, An Evolution of Faith. As a pastor, I felt like I should know all the right answers and responses to how to deal with what Barth syndrome brought into our lives. I had to make a crucial decision if I would let this diagnosis pull me away from God or pull me closer to Him. Hearing this story was so encouraging and helped me recognize the journey of faith that must happen.
That episode, I think I listened to it 4 or 5 times. I live in Texas. I live in Houston. I was traveling to Austin at the time, and there were just so many poignant moments in their story that just really resonated with me. And I was glad. I know that the podcast is religion neutral, but I was glad to have that moment and to feel those feelings.
Yeah, that was like, honestly, that was so scary to do that 2-part episode. It was so scary because, and I mentioned this in the intro of that episode, but we talk about really vulnerable stuff on the podcast, obviously. I feel like I'm an open book. I've shared the most intimate things, but like to talk about religion is intimate in a different way. I was like, oh my gosh. Like, I don't know. I was picturing like mean remarks. I didn't get any. Of course, no one here is stupid and gonna say something mean to me about like religion or whatever. But like, it was cool to have a dedicated space to be like, for those who would be offended or they just wouldn't want to listen to that kind of thing can skip this episode, but for people who want it can listen. And so that was really meaningful to tackle that one.
It was powerful.
I remember you texted me while I was in Michael's or something, and you're like, I just keep crying with this episode. And I was like, I love making people cry. When people tell me they cry for an episode,
it's so healing. You just don't feel alone, and you feel connected, and you feel seen. And I just think we all long for that. And it was just such a beautiful 2 episodes.
And one thing I was thinking while Laurel was talking at the beginning is just the loneliness, or she was saying like it helps you know you're not the only one. That's not how she phrased it, but I don't know. I feel like that's one of the powerful things that it's focused on rare syndromes, because we're like the misfits. Like we don't really have these big groups to join. And I mean, like some of these diagnoses, there's like 8 in the world, or even like they're the only one, or even if you do have a bigger group, it's just so nice that we can band together and be like, we may not understand each other's specific diagnoses and exactly what each other's going through, but there are so many themes that we do understand. And even the fact that we don't have a big group, we can relate on that. And so that's been a really cool part of it too.
Yeah, small but mighty.
Honestly, though, there are 7,000 different types of rare diseases. So really like small by ourselves, but together it's a big population. That's a big affected group. That's a lot of different syndromes, which again, when I hear that, I'm like, oh, we got to get this out to more people because there's so many people that could relate with this stuff.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Laurel. Last but not least, listener Rebecca, and she is also a parent listener.
Hi, my name's Rebecca, and I'm a single parent and carer to my son Dylan, who is 11. He has a rare chromosomal disorder that is unique to him. He is entirely tube-fed, non-verbal, and loves the stars and moon and rainbows. The Rare Life has become a real gem in the toolbox of coping skills I use to deal with the stress and anxiety that comes with parenting my son. Listening to the podcast feels like talking to a friend who completely understands and validates all my emotions without having to feel drained at the same time by talking about my experience. My favourite episode was the episode on health anxiety. My son had just been through a long period of repeated medical trauma at the time, and my hypervigilance and PTSD was very heightened. Listening to this episode felt like receiving a really comforting, big, warm hug. I just wanted to say thank you to Madeline for the gift of the Rare Life to all of us parents on this journey. Thank you so much.
Rebecca, I seriously loved listening to this message. I feel like we're friends that don't totally know each other, because Rebecca messaged me a written message on Instagram. And so that's why I asked her to do the takeaway. And it's so cool when I hear from people, because I'm like, it's not just going out into an abyss. There are real live people listening to this. And I loved connecting with Rebecca and Laurel and Hillary and so many of you. It just is such an honor actually interacting with people, because it is just kind of like recording something and sending it off. And so it's so cool to hear from people.
Rebecca, I just want to give you a big hug. Just love on Dylan.
Yeah, it was really cool too with episode 85, because that's the one that Hillary also mentioned. And it doesn't surprise me that that one was the favorite for both of you, because it resonated with so many people. And that was a really cool one to conceive. Like when I had the idea, like looking through Amanda's, she had the idea, but I picked up her idea and asked her to do an interview. It was cool because I was like, this is something that people are really going to relate with. And then to watch it happen and to see how much it resonated was really, really cool. Wow, it was so fun.
The other thing that I think is so amazing about the timing of how this podcast has evolved and the topics you're discussing on your episodes is that we're in a time of life where everyone is very transparent about their feelings, whether that's anxiety, depression, PTSD, all these buzzwords, gaslighting, all these things. I'm just so proud that we're able to talk about these things and bring them to the light. Whereas I feel like if this podcast was around couple of decades before, not even that long ago, people would have never said, I'm struggling with depression, or I'm struggling with PTSD due to this, and I can't sleep, and all these different topics that are just very timely. And I'm so glad that the world is ready to talk about it at this time.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think that's where all the meaning is when we start talking about the nitty gritty, cringy stuff.
And again, so Brene Brown's from Houston, but vulnerability, like what a word. And I praise for it because it's so important. It's critical.
Yeah. And even messages like with what Rebecca just said of just being like really honest, like this is hard. I've had a hard time. And I feel like there's something that just we connect with each other so easily when we do that. And that's a Brene Brown thing too. But just the power of vulnerability. And that's honestly they've kind of become like the main focus, the main goal with the podcast. How vulnerable can we be? Like, where's the cringy stuff? Like, what can we talk about?
The rawness. And I loved also what she said when she was like, I can listen to the podcast and feel validated and feel like someone has listened to me without the exhaustion of explaining where you're coming from. And I think probably all of the listeners can relate. I'm just one of a very small amount of handful in my Houston network that has come into contact with rare genetic conditions. And it is a lot to explain what it is, what are the symptoms, how did they figure it out? And so I can see how this podcast can just take away that burden and puts everybody in, like you were saying earlier, you may not know every detail, but you feel like you're heard and validated and that the person on the receiving end totally gets where you're coming from.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm trying to figure out what it is, but there's like something about recording an episode and sending it out into the world without needing to have, like I've had family members before be like, why didn't you tell me? Like, you've never told me about how hard this was. And it's interesting because I'm like, I don't know. It just feels safer just to record it and send it out, and then they can consume it on their own terms and they don't have to think of what to say. And I feel like there is like this safety and this ease in being able to just like Rebecca said, listen to it on your own terms and not necessarily have the right things to say or respond with. You can just passively listen, but have it resonate.
I like that a lot.
All right. Well, that was awesome. Thank you, Hillary, Laurel, and Rebecca. Okay, so moving on to more like behind the scenes and updates. I know we've talked a bit about them sprinkled in there, but as I mentioned, this is the 2-year anniversary. And so I've been like reflecting and stuff. And it is so cool to specifically with season 5, this last season, we have had unprecedented growth with listener base. And that is so exciting because I do focus on the numbers. Like I look at that, I want them to keep growing and growing, but I also will take a minute sometimes and be like, whoa, like each one of these is a person, like a human being. And that means so much to picture. Like there might be a Laurel or a Rebecca or a Hillary and
love that,
or a Brittany. And so like,
yeah, or Brittany.
Always Brittany. You're always in there. Yeah, it's just so cool to see the growth shoot up and that excitement of that momentum. But also, I was writing in my journal today about this. I feel like there's this hunger, this unsatiable hunger of, but more, but more. We can always reach more. And so as meaningful as each one is, and because of each one and how meaningful each one is. And so again, a little plug for the ambassador team if you want to share that way. I also forgot to mention, like, with that, if you don't want to commit and you're like, I don't know, I'm in over my head, but I can still share this thing, like, the informal shares are just as, those are so meaningful. So meaningful. Telling a friend and being like, oh, this episode might resonate with you, or at the doctor's office and be like, hey, by the way, there's this podcast. Any kind of share, or on social media, like, that's been something that has really increased in the last bit of people sharing episodes on social media. And that is another awesome way for people to hear about it. And so keep up all the sharing. I know you're out there sharing this thing and it means so much. So thank you.
And I was so proud to personally share the episode that our family sponsored in Logan's honor. And I got so much feedback from people I went to college with, people I knew from high school, friends of friends that saw it or got shared. And I just think the power of even just putting it on your Instagram, and you never know who it's going to hit and who might need it or who might be coming into the community like me 8 months ago, not knowing. I found the Rare Life through Google, and then also through, I'd seen someone had shared something of yours, Madeline, regards to, like, I think it was part of an appointment day episode or how to manage that. And she lives in Fort Worth, and I do not know this mom, and she has a daughter with Down syndrome, but she had shared some of your clips because she's a follower of the podcast. So I'd been to your Instagram page before I even Googled it that night. So, I mean, I do think that was part of the groundwork of me slowly easing my way into your messages, and then fast forward 8 months being like, hey, can I sponsor this episode and to help do all these things? But I just think you never know how one share could set in motion a bigger wave.
Yeah, totally. And you think about, like, again, the Laurel, the Rebecca, the Hillary, even if it's one person, it means so much, you know? And so, I mean, I'm not going to pretend like it's for everyone. I know that, like, there might be people who listen and are like, oh my gosh, this is way too, like, moody. Like, I can't handle this. And, like, I'm not into this. That's fine. But, like, there could be people who really do connect with it and are impacted by it in a really meaningful way. And so, yeah, just those shares. And every time I see a share, like, on social media, because I'll see the numbers and I'll be like, there's that many people that liked this episode that much that they want to share it. That means so much to me.
It's amazing.
So exciting.
I love it.
So, yeah, thank you for all the shares. Keep it up. That is so impactful. Oh, and as a kind of related thing, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, there's a way to leave reviews where, like, you actually, like, type out a review, and those are also super meaningful. I love reading those, but there's also, it's like a way to, like, when I'm trying to get big shot guests, I feel like sometimes they look at that, maybe they don't. I don't know. But that's great too. If you can take a minute to put a review on there. And I think
if you're in Spotify, on the homepage of the Rare Life, hit the 3 dots to the right of the screw and you can go to rate show.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you listen on Spotify, that also is great, just to kind of, I don't know, if someone's, like, browsing through and they're like, oh, it has really good reviews, maybe I'll listen to it. Like, that can make the difference too. So there are some ways to spread the word that would be really meaningful and awesome of you. So moving on to our last behind the scenes topic of funding. And that's where Brittany, like, that's kind of her main thing, is she's here to help me get funding so we can keep the Rare Life a thing. So Brittany, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I originally messaged Madeline and was like, I would like to sponsor an episode, and here's a personal family commitment. But I also, in my long email to her, I had said, I don't have a medically complex child on this earth, but I do know a lot about raising money, and I do know a lot about causes, and I am just fired up and fueled to bring this platform to more people. And I know that Madeline needs financial support in order for us to do that. That's just how business works. So I just got really excited. I've got a lot of connections in the health system, and so we kind of just started playing around with ideas, and we've gotten some good traction. I'm really excited about our potential corporate sponsorships, and our goal is to really work with companies that are used in the medical community. So we really want to partner with companies that our guests use, or they have services or medical device items that are part of their family care, And these companies care about our kids, and they care about us, and they care about our families. And we've gotten some really great traction. So I'm super excited and really hopeful we get some great new sponsors for season 6.
Yeah, it's been super cool. Like, we've met virtually with a few of the representatives for some of these big companies. They're like medical companies. Like, they're not like services. Like, these are like, they make orthotics or feeding tube supplies, whatever. Like, things you would just think are kind of sterile. Like, they don't care, but they do. Like, it's so cool to meet with them. And they're like, yes, we want this for families. We want to help them. We care about how they're doing, like, emotionally and stuff. So that's been like a super cool part of it, to create these relationships with them. And like Brittany was saying, like, we want to work with companies that have products that either the guests have used and can vouch for, or that we have, so that, I don't know, I'm kind of protective of you guys. Like, I'm not just going to tell you about crap. So
we didn't want it to be like an Ovaltine commercial in the middle of a very vulnerable topic. So we were trying to avoid that. We want to avoid that at all costs. And, you know, again, a shout out, if you have company connections, or you work for a company, or your family has a company, or any sort of introduction, if you think anyone you know would be interested on the corporate sponsorship side, please let us know.
Yeah, that would mean so much. It'd be so helpful in sustaining the podcast.
Yeah, we really just want to keep the conversation going, and again, be able to make it bigger and expand it to more people, and got to get some funds to do that.
Yeah, and that funding is so important in helping the podcast grow. Like, for example, we've for the first time ever been able to hire an editor of the episode. So I'm not spending hours and hours a week editing. I can hand it off to actually a listener who is an editor by profession, and hire those out. And I've been able to have childcare for my kids while I'm working instead of putting them in front of movies. So there's just really a lot of ways that this funding is helping the podcast be sustained and be able to grow in the long term.
Yes.
And then also, like, we've mentioned this before, but the way that like Brittany was able to sponsor an episode, if that speaks to you, if you have the funds to support in that way, that is also super great. And I want to work with you on like, okay, here's the lineup of episodes I have. Which one would you like to sponsor? What means a lot to you? And the corporate level sponsorships mean a lot to me, but the personal ones, I'm like, oh my gosh, like they care that much. Like when Brittany offered to sponsor an episode, I was like, that means a lot, thinking about that type of support. And then we have an episode in the off season that's also sponsored by a family. And again, it just means so much. So all types of support are so needed and so appreciated. So there's a link in the show notes if you want to message me about that too, about either a connection you have with a company or a corporation that might want to sponsor, or if you want to on a personal or like family level. So check that out if you're interested. Okay, so this was so fun to reflect on season 5 and all the episodes in there and the podcast as a whole. There will be a 9-week break between seasons 5 and 6, so I can catch up on episodes. I'll be working hard producing brand new episodes for season 6. The theme for that one, and I'll talk a lot more about the theme in the kickoff episode, which releases July 28th, so mark your calendars. But the theme for that one is based on relationships and how those have changed and how they're affected by our children with disabilities. We did cover this theme last year in season 3, and I'm so excited to dive back in because there's so many angles we can take with this, talking about siblings and marriage and so many different avenues.
So many.
So excited about that one. But yeah, in the meantime, I'm happy to announce that we will be re-releasing popular episodes that are kind of older ones that a lot of you newer listeners have probably missed. And those are handpicked. Those are ones I'm like, yeah, they'll want this one, or oh, like I can't wait for more people to hear this one. So each Thursday, as usual, those will be released, and the full episode will be in there with a brand new little intro from me. And keep the habit, like keep listening. We're still here for you, hard at work, and we will see you back July 28th for season 6 kickoff.
I'm excited.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Brittany, for joining me. This is so fun.
Oh my gosh, it was so fun to sit sidecar. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So join us next week for our first rebroadcasted episode for The Break.